All right, seems like the number is stabilizing, so let's get started. Thanks everyone, good afternoon, thanks for being here. My name is Michaela Campbell. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the Congressional Fire Services Institute, or CFSI. And thanks everyone for joining us today for this webinar with our great panel of experts. Before we get started, as I'm sure everyone knows, having used Zoom for a while now, we will be taking questions through the Q&A, or you can also use the chat box if you prefer. In general, I will be holding questions till the end, but feel free to type them in at any time. And if it makes sense, we'll take it during the webinar. And if not, we'll take it during the last few minutes. But please feel free to ask questions. We've got some great folks here to share their expertise, and feel free to pepper away with the questions. So to get started, I'm very pleased to be joined today by our panel of experts. We have Chief Rich Elliott. He is the Deputy Fire Chief at Kittitas Valley Fire and Rescue in Washington State. He is also the Chair of the Wildland Fire Policy Committee for the International Association of Fire Chiefs. We are also joined today by Michele Steinberg, who is the Wildfire Division Director at the National Fire Protection Association and a board member of the International Association of Wildland Fire. And finally, we have Karl Fippinger, who is Vice President of Government Relations, Fire and Disaster Mitigation at the International Code Council. So thanks to you three for being here today. And Michele, let's start it off. Can you give us some background on wildland fire and the wildland fire season?
I'm happy to. Thank you, Michaela. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of wildfire season 2021, which we really should call wildfire year. This is some information from our USA Current Wildfires map, a feature layer from Esri that pulls data from federal databases, including Irwin and NIFC. And I believe some of my co-presenters will be talking about those agencies and entities. But it gives you an idea of the very active fire year we've had so far. Right now, what we're seeing, we talk about wildfire season, but really this is a time when we're seeing wildfires year-round across the U.S., more and more out of season than what we've been used to in the past. The data for this year is about average, a little bit above average when it's the numbers of fires, and a little bit below average based on the last 10 years of the size of burned area. But particularly residents of Western states know that we've been experiencing intense wildfires earlier and more impactfully in the recent years than in previous decades. These are fire incidents with their status from the last 7 days. Some of these are in various states of suppression and so forth, and containment. And interestingly to me, looking at this today, 300,000 or more is the largest icon that you see. The Dixie fire burning in Northern California is more than twice that size. So this doesn't give you a complete relative picture of the size of these wildfires. What you do need to know is that there are more than 100 large fires over 12 states in the US right now. The country has been at National Preparedness Level 5, which is the highest level, meaning that the majority of the nation's firefighting resources are committed. And this has been going on for a month and a half, since July 14th. As I mentioned, this is sort of the comparison year to date. So January 1st to today, August 30th, where we are with numbers of fires, where we are with numbers of acres. And you can see that this is roughly average to the last decade on the same date. But this is significantly trending larger fires in particular over time. So the next slide really shows you, looking since the 1960s, that the acres that we have burned by wildfire are significantly increasing over time. That's due to a number of reasons. We never not have wildfires. Wildfires are part of our environment in North America. But you can see that this year in particular, we're under extreme stress from drought in many parts of the West. To have exceptional drought, the dark red in so many places around the country is really alarming. And this is just one of the conditions that means that when fires start, they will tend to do a lot more damage, tend to grow big, and tend to do that kind of damage that we fear. Just to give you a snapshot Of course, 2020 was a very significant fire year, but we're looking on the right at July of last year with the drought situation compared to July of this year. So you can see the significant difference. These long-term droughts just don't go away in a single season. What I'm showing next, and this is the predictive services from the National Interagency Fire Center, or NIFC. This is significant wildfire potential outlook. Since it's the end of August, I skipped the August map, but you can see that above normal is the red, normal is white. Normal does not mean no fire, but looking at the green, knowing it's hurricane season, and we do, our hearts go out to the folks in the Gulf Coast and Louisiana with Ida, but they're obviously getting a lot of rain, which makes wildfire rather difficult. But you are seeing significant potential for wildfire when it starts to be large, to be impactful, and to spread quickly in those areas in the red. Into October, we're still looking at the sort of upper Rockies, Northern Rockies in California, but now we're also looking at the Eastern Seaboard. And then into November, we're now looking at Florida having an elevated risk of potential wildfires. And again, these are long-term outlooks, but we know that the trends to fires are significantly moving in a direction that concerns everyone in terms of loss of life, property, and resources. And certainly, particularly at NFPA, where we work on fire protection and safety for wildfire in the built environment, the structures lost to fire is a significant problem. What I like to point out with this map is now, and we are looking for an updated map, and I'll provide a resource link to something a little bit newer that you can use. But this gives a graphic depiction of where we have these sort of disasters of fire where hundreds or even thousands of homes or structures are destroyed in a single incident. Of course, you see a lot of that in California. You're seeing that through the Rockies, into the Northwest, into the East. So we see that the Gatlinburg fires of 2016 are captured here in Eastern Tennessee, major fires like Bastrop in Texas. But what's also should be concerning to us are those little black dots. Those are reported zero structures. It's a wildfire occurred, but no structures burned. It looks like sort of pepper shaker across the map. And this is where we become concerned, because where fire was, fire will be again. And as development encroaches into some of these wildfire prone areas, the future will look like a lot more big red dots. That's our concern. I want to turn it back over to the rest of the group. I've given you a quick picture, and I'll talk a little bit in a while about understanding risk and taking action. Thanks, Michaela.
Great, thanks, Michelle, and thanks for the overviews. I think the maps are particularly useful to help conceptualize just how universal of a problem this is, particularly in the United States. So, Chief Elliott, from your perspective, from the chief's perspective, can you talk a little bit about the wildland fire problem and what you're seeing?
Yes. So from the local community's perspective, and that's the IFC essentially represents local government in this endeavor. Many communities still don't have an effective tie-in with their federal and state partners. And in doing so, therefore, when wildfires break out sort of in adjoining regions and things, there's oftentimes a delay in communication to sort of facilitate bringing the community up to speed so they understand what the true risks are and that they actively participate in evacuations in a timely manner. Because when we put people and or infrastructure in front of the fires, the problems become a lot more complex. Many communities this year are currently or have been at risk. The local agencies this year we've been finding have been holding back resources that they normally would contribute to regional response efforts. That's in part due to COVID, staffing shortages, unrelated to COVID, but just retirements and a difficulty in hiring people, and in some cases due to increased local risk. We at the IFC have been very focused on collectively trying to develop a more interoperable system. And so what we mean by that is that we want the local agencies, the state agencies, and in this case, the federal partners to work before the fire is on the landscape, during the fire, and after the fire to mitigate the impacts to wildfire, and hopefully in the future even further mitigate or even prevent some of these issues from popping back up. We want to point out that all fires start local, and typically it's the local agencies that is left to deal with the after effects, sometimes as long as a decade long, for impacts on watersheds and flooding impacts and rebuilding infrastructure. We want to reduce the barriers for timely cooperative prevention, mitigation, and response. And we believe that local agencies can be a really effective partner for the federal agencies in helping them with active land management, prescribed fire, the concept of pods, which we'll talk about later on in the process, and most importantly, code implementation. I don't want to steal Karl's deal, but we feel like the local agencies, most land use codes are local, and we feel like we can advocate for that. And I will just say our staffing we've been getting about 50% of our requested resources when we were initially dispatched to wildfires. And the fire I worked 2 weeks ago, I lost 40% of the 50 to COVID impacts in a matter of 2 days. So COVID is still rearing its head, and that's all I have.
Thanks, Chief. And I think that's a great point that I want to reiterate, is that there are a lot of great minds at the state, local, and federal levels, and it is fire is not just an issue that you see locally, there's also a national impact, a federal impact. And fortunately, we've got great folks at all levels of government working on this, but the interoperability piece is something that is particularly important. So thanks for bringing that up. And so moving over to Karl for a moment, I want to touch on something that Michele had mentioned earlier, where fire has been, fire will be again, and that we are also seeing expanses in where people are building. So when we talk about wildland fire, a lot of times we talk about the wildland urban interface, or the WUI. Karl, can you explain a little bit about what that is, where it is, and how it's grown?
Absolutely. I'd be glad to break that down. And like Michele did too, I'll make sure that I put some of these links that I'm referencing in the chat here after I finish up my sections as well. So in terms of what is the wildland urban interface, or the WUI, so the United States Fire Administration is really kind of our best source for that definition as far as the fire service is concerned. So the United States Fire Administration defines the WUI as the zone of transition between occupied land and human development. It's the line or area or zone where structures and other human development meet or even intermingle with undeveloped wildland or even vegetative fuels. So that's really the traditional definition. Where is the WUI? That's a bit of a moving target, and it continues to move today. I think you're seeing construction in the WUI and with environmental change kind of on the doorstep here and occurring in many places. You're seeing the WUI expand into areas that haven't seen it before, revisiting it for the first time in decades or even a century. So where is the WUI? So wildland fire data from the National Interagency Fire Center, or NIFC, out in Boise, Idaho, as well as property data from and intelligence from financial services firm CoreLogic, demonstrate that really no state is free from wildland fire risk. So in effect, we all have wildland fire risk, and we live with it every day. It's really just a matter of frequency for the most part, and then some of these current events like Ida impacting the Gulf Coast and mid-states there that are experiencing higher than normal rainfall. So to be reminded of where we've had wildfire before and that we're all at risk, we only have to look to a few historical examples. I go back as far as the Great Fires of 1947 in Maine, the Sunrise Wildfire more recently in 1995 that occurred in the Long Island Pine Barrens of New York. 2008, we saw the South One fire here in Virginia, where I live, that was largely in the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. And then, of course, Michele hit on this a little bit earlier, the 2016 Great Smoky Mountains wildfires in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. So that said, really over the last 20 to 25 years, we've seen consistently about 15 US states, from the Southern Rockies, South Central US, west to California, and then north in the Northern Rockies into the Pacific Northwest, that have ranked among the highest in WUI risk and in acres burned. So these states include Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Florida, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Oregon, Texas, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming, to be pretty specific. How has the WUI grown? It's a really great question. So a 2018 National Academy of Sciences report highlighted how rapid growth of the WUI raises wildland fire risk. So from 1990 to 2010, the number of new houses in the WUI grew by 41%, and WUI land area grew by 33%, making the WUI the fastest growing land use type in the United States. Now, those numbers only run through 2010 due to the constraints of the census, and we really only expect those to grow, and we'll know more once we have more granular census data and we can take a better look at it. So I'll wrap with a little bit of information in terms of our risk and vulnerability. According to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, more than 46 million residences and 70,000 communities across the US are at risk to WUI fires. For the 1.7 million homes ranked by CoreLogic as having either high or extreme risk to wildland fire, the estimated reconstruction cost value, or RCV in industry terms, equals more than $538 billion with a B. That number soars to over $8 trillion when we add moderate and low risk homes to the equation. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of the problem and how we're defining it and what we're looking at today.
Thanks, Karl. And I'm actually going to go right back to you on this one. So we have a problem. It's growing. It's significant. It's across the country. How can communities understand their risk, and also what can they be doing to mitigate some of that risk?
Well, I'll let some of my colleagues speak to that too, because that's a great question, I think, for all of us. But I'll speak specifically to my role and the work that I do with my colleagues at the International Code Council. So the Code Council is a nonprofit organization, and we develop model codes and standards, and they're used in the design, build, and compliance process to construct safe, sustainable, affordable, and resilient structures. So that's commercial buildings, homes, anything in the built environment. The international codes, or the I-codes, are a family of 15 contemporary coordinated model codes, and they include the International Building Code, which is used in all 50 states, the International Fire Code, and the International Wildland Urban Interface Code, or the WUI Code. So the ICC's WUI Code establishes minimum requirements for land use and the built environment in designated WUI areas, right? So this is kind of our number one tool that works with our other codes to help combat the wildland fire problem. And how do we do that? Well, the code looks at prescriptive and performance-related provisions, including ignition-resistant construction, defensible space, fire protection planning, which is I know is near and dear to the heart of our fire-adapted communities, considerations for public safety access, community evacuation, and then also adequate water supplies for wildland fire suppression. So, you know, the International Wildland Urban Interface Code is really the main tool that we've got, and there are others that my colleagues can certainly talk about between tools and programs and resources today, but that's really the main tool that we've got in the toolbox to help with this. So back talking a little bit about the effectiveness of the WUI Code, let me talk about that in terms of maybe some national cost benefit and savings that might come from adopting a code. So the 2019 National Institute of Building Sciences report, this is NIBS, they have a report, and it was the Natural Hazard Mitigation SAYS report from 2019. And it found that adopting up-to-date editions of the codes generates a national benefit of $11 for every $1 invested. And that's just generally speaking for the codes overall. When we focus on the wildland fire problem, when we talk about a WUI code, NIBS found that the national mitigation benefit cost ratio could have benefits as high as $8 for every $1 invested for wildland fires. Okay, so this is generated, just to get an idea where that savings comes from, it's generated from avoided casualties, post-traumatic stress, property damage, business interruptions, and avoided costs due to increased insurance premium. So that savings goes right back in the pocket, and it's a great investment. So that's how I would answer that one.
Thanks, Karl. So Michele, I'll throw the question to you. Can you talk a little bit about how NFPA is looking at wildland fire, and same question, what can communities be doing to help reduce their risk?
Sure, and I'm back to sharing my slides. I guess I work better with pictures. So I do want people to know of understanding your risk. The Forest Service and other partners on the federal and private side a couple years ago came out with this wildfire risk to communities tool, which is a really great, I'm going to see if we can look at the internet, and Michaela can tell me if we're actually able to see the actual internet link on this. It's taken a second. If not, I'll explain a little bit more. What this does is pull in a lot of data for people to be able to take a look at and I guess it's not going, so, oh, there it goes, okay. For people to be able to take a look at the relative risk of right down to their community. It could be their city, their county, their town, or even their state vis-a-vis other states, counties, or towns. And this is looking at the relative risk of a wildfire damaging structures, the exposure that the area has to wildfire, whether that's direct or indirect, and other factors such as demographics that may make it more dangerous for people living in that area. So things like, you know, seniors, basically people over the age of 65, percentage of people in manufactured housing, et cetera, indicators that we know make it harder for people to perhaps do the mitigation work. And it's not going to show us the internet, so we'll give up on that. And now I've got to make sure we go back to the slide. But basically, this is great to explore. It's very simple, wildfirerisk.org to take a look at. When you go to the explore function, this will let you take a look at the different mapping tools that are there. This is just a still picture. We've seen that okay, Michaela? Yep. Okay, so just a still snapshot of Colorado relative risk to other states. You can see the red is the higher risk communities and developments there. And then as you click across the top bar with exposure, whether it's direct or indirect, the likelihood of wildfire, again, compared to other states or towns or cities, whatever you're looking at, and vulnerable populations. It's very handy. And this overall website has many, many tools from different agencies and organizations like NFPA that support people in then taking action on what they can do to reduce risk. Now, Karl mentioned codes and standards, which NFPA also produces on a number of fire and hazard issues. But we also have been working on public outreach and community engagement for many years. This is basically our flagship public outreach program to help people take action towards their risk. Firewise USA. This is a voluntary program. It now has coming up on 1,900 sites across 43 states. It does include Alaska and Hawaii. It's just always hard to get them on the single map picture. But what this program does is encourage individual responsibility. It encourages neighbors to work together. It is voluntary, as I mentioned, so there is no regulation involved here or money changing hands, although we do ask folks to sort of count up hours and time invested to get essentially a dollar figure that values their time in reducing risk. And it not only helps to protect private property, but it's also going to help first responders be safer and effective when fire comes. And we have many examples of this happening over the years, that places that are doing these kinds of things across the community are reducing the risk. We also promote an annual Wildfire Community Preparedness Day campaign. That's the first Saturday in May. That's been generously supported by State Farm for a number of years with small grants to communities, but it's sort of that entry-level way to get people in trying something for the first time that hopefully they then go on to do more. One of the really important policy areas, though, is the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy that has been around now for over a decade. And this is sort of an all hands, all lands approach. This is intended not only for the federal family to work together on these goals, but also private and local and state and nonprofit organizations like NFPA. So the three tenets or the three goals here are to have resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities, and wildfire response. Primarily, NFPA has been working in that fire adapted community space, whether it's the regulatory side with promoting the use of codes and standards to make sure that buildings coming into these high-risk areas are built appropriately and safely, or it's getting the volunteer action for communities that are already there at risk. That's mainly where NFPA has been working, and of course with our partners in wildfire response, the fire service. But more recently, NFPA has launched basically a policy initiative, Outthink Wildfire. It's a call to action, and we're looking to end this problem of destruction of communities by wildfire over the next 30 years. And it's rooted in really two realities. One is that we know, as I've said, wildfire is going to happen. North America is by and large a wildfire environment. And the fire service simply cannot, in the face of these increasing wildfires, the increasing amount of development in their path, they're not going to be able to keep up with just trying to put the fire out once it starts. We need that proactive pre-fire action to be happening across a whole spectrum: state, local, federal, private, and public. So these are the 5 action policies that we are promoting as part of all this. The first is essentially looking at what's on the ground today and making sure everything that we know that is at risk is protected. And that means retrofitting homes, doing those home improvements, working on the landscape in communities to reduce the risk. And that can come in the form of regulation, voluntary action, incentives, you name it. We need to get to those 46 million homes that Karl mentioned. The second is that new construction and development really needs to be following model codes and standards. It's super important to have this basis so that wildfire is taken into account. Part of the problem that we face now with these 46 million homes is very few of them, relatively speaking, were built with fire in mind. So we have an enormous problem to tackle. Of course, making sure that the fire service, who we call on in these times of crisis to save us, can do that so they can be safe and effective. A lot of NFPA's work in looking at the statistics and surveying the fire service shows that local fire departments, these are your volunteer and paid organizations in the cities and towns and counties, that they don't have what they need in terms of training a lot of the time for all of their staff that respond to wildfires. They don't have the proper gear in many cases. And these are almost 90% of fire departments responding to our survey at the local level are responding to wildfires. So they all need to have what they need to be safe and effective. We're calling on our land management agencies, whether they be state or federal, to do more about reducing the hazardous fuels, much of this through the longstanding Healthy Forest Restoration Act. Work is ongoing, but it's been slow, and we need to have people come together to figure out what treatments we need on the landscape to reduce the magnitude of these fires and the damaging effects. And finally, we do need to continue to support our public in knowledge and ways to take action to protect themselves, not only to protect the property, but to know what to do and how to keep their families safe in the event of these inevitable wildfires. What we're trying to do is turn it from back to a natural event and not a disaster anymore. I'll stop sharing now.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And Chief Elliott, I'll throw it to you. What are you seeing in your community, and what can communities be doing to reduce their risk?
So, and I'll tag on to the cohesive strategy. When we talk about resilient landscapes, local agencies can participate and advocate and communicate the value of active land management. So this could be prescribed burning, it can be fuels mitigation. Sometimes those projects sort of go on in the background, and the community develops resistance because they don't fully understand. And sort of our mantra is, you're going to see smoke. Do you want to see smoke under controlled situations, or do you want it to be mixed in with houses with carcinogens and be devastating? A fire that may burn in one community in March may be significantly more beneficial and less impactful than one that burns in August. And so we feel like we can be that. We put out the America Burning WUI. Actually, we didn't solely do this. This was a partnership with a number of different entities, but basically to update, the country on and try to educate them on the fact that this is becoming a growing problem in our community. It has economic, it has public safety, it has quality of life impacts, and we're sort of looking for everybody to sort of pay attention to this issue and realize that the problems that have developed in our wildland interface and in our forests have occurred over 110, 115 years for well-intentioned policies, but we probably need to amend some of those. In terms of fire adapted communities, we tagged on to FireWise, which is an excellent program, and created the Ready, Set, Go program, which effectively the Ready piece ties in the FireWise, but basically, again, is a private property owner, local government take responsibility for getting your community, getting your property ready, having the things that you would need if you do need to evacuate, and then leaving in a controlled manner that is relatively safe. And again, I'd just like to reemphasize that, when we introduce infrastructure, particularly hard to replace infrastructure, people's homes, and most importantly, people into the footprint of a wildfire, the complexity of the incident gets really difficult to manage, and the risk level goes up by a significant factor. We have the Fire Department Exchange Program, where we're trying to share the ideas that work in different communities, how we manage our land, how we prepare our communities. We have that program where we're sharing that between local fire agencies. In terms of safe and effective wildfire response, we sometimes forget that we send law enforcement out in most communities in front of these fires to facilitate evacuations, oftentimes without any training or sort of knowledge about when they would be in trouble. So we put together a program for law enforcement. We're trying to backfill and staff the incident management teams. We're having a succession staffing issue on the wildland management teams. That's a federal level. That occurs at the federal level, the state level, and the local agencies. These teams are oftentimes cooperatively staffed, and we're losing more people than we're gaining at the time when we're going out more often. And then we've already mentioned this, but the local agency integrated response, what the local communities can do is seek out their state and their federal partner agencies, and not demand, but facilitate that conversation, meet each other ahead of time, have an idea what the overall strategic planning is for this segment of the forest for this period of time, and be involved in any fuels mitigation work, be involved, train. We want our agencies to be trained up and equipped to the level where we could integrate into the state and the federal incidents relatively easily without any concerns about safety or interoperability. And so those are the things that we're really pushing, is that these incidents generally occur adjacent to communities. They're relatively small, and if we can integrate ourselves into those responses more effectively, we feel like a number of those incidents that end up getting large, might be kept small and therefore relatively low risk and low cost.
Great, thanks, Chief. And I'm actually going to come back to you on this one, since I think you mentioned it really well and set it up pretty perfectly. So your point about inter and intergovernmental assistance is particularly important, and one that you've done a great job, I think, mentioning throughout. And we've talked a lot about ways that communities at the state and local level can work to mitigate their risk and address their infrastructure, et cetera. But since we are lucky enough to be joined by several representatives from federal partners today, can we talk a little bit more about the federal role and what the federal partners and programs are that are involved in addressing these WUI issues?
Absolutely. And to start off, the list I'm going to give you, a lot of it are very successful programs that are working very well. So this isn't a list of wants necessarily, as maybe continue some of these programs. But we start off with active land management, and that's something that in the West, I don't think we do a very good job. You can look down into the Southeast, Georgia, Florida, that area, and they have developed a culture where their forests are actively managed. They're healthy forests. They're somewhat resistant to the effects of fire. They have forest products industries that is on the increase, not the decline. And the West Coast could probably learn something from that. And some of that has to do with prescribed burning. Prescribed burning is a very difficult, highly litigious it's kind of like being a high-risk OB doctor. It's almost impossible to get insurance. And so some assistance with liability out of 100 prescribed burns, one of them is going to get away and going to cause some unintended consequences. But if the liability is so high that nobody's willing to do that work, then we're stuck with the result, which is devastating, catastrophic, sterilizing fires that occur in the summer, in our case, in the summer. Also, air quality. I know that EPA, a number of different federal agencies right now is working on sort of studying the difference between prescribed burning smoke and the smoke that comes out of a wildfire when it's mixed in with cars and houses and infrastructure, and trying to detail the fact that one's different than the other, and maybe we need to relax the requirements on, or the restrictions on, wildfire smoke when it's managed correctly. Grazing done correctly is part of the solution. Managing transportation corridors. We see in some cases pressure to not use either chemical or mechanical treatments roadside, and therefore we're getting more roadside starts. Having a healthy forest product industry in each region so that the biomass that needs to come out of the land can be processed in a way that makes economic sense. We also look at the federal agencies have been really good at establishing what we call POD, which are potential operational delineations. Essentially, they look at areas ahead of time and they say, okay, if a fire starts here, here's where our control points would need to be. That communication to the local and even maybe to some extent the state agencies, if that were done, more consistently, it's done really well in some regions. Would make the public a little less fearful of a fire when it breaks out. They'll say, okay, we know it's going to do some good. It's going to, burn up some stuff that probably needs its fire interval. But we have a plan to stop it at this size. Recover and reforestation. Again, monospecies reforestations prove to be part of the problem. And so when we go back and replant lands, either as a result of logging or a fire or the combination of the two, doing it in a way that develops the ecosystem that is probably going to need to be tailored to what we anticipate the climate's going to be, not what it is. In terms of suppression and response, we're working on NMAS, which is almost and I hate to use the acronym, but it's an Uber style phone app that would allow local agencies, states, and federal agencies to collect the resources earlier in the process, and then those resources would feed into the regional dispatch centers through IROC and to make sure that they're detailed and then they can be paid for. And then there's a reimbursement component for local government. Sometimes that takes 6, 8, 10 months. And for small agencies, sometimes footing that bill for those labor costs it can be difficult. In terms of government, continued participation and support for WIFLC, the Wildfire Leadership Council, we very much appreciate that. And then all of the grant programs that you guys have been doing, the rural volunteer and small fire agency grant system. That's how we get PPE for small agencies. And then we've got the FEP and the FFFP program, which basically take the federal surplus apparatus, sometimes that's military, place it into agencies with some investment. They can turn those into fire apparatus that lasts another 20 or 30 years, a very high quality fire apparatus. The only thing that I would potentially ask for there is sometimes the reporting requirements for these grants are more onerous than the grants themselves, and sometimes the issue about having to take something from the military, invest $50,000 or $100,000 into it, and then having that be constantly audited and going back to the federal government is, sort of prevents some agencies from doing it. So to the extent possible, streamlining those programs. And then finally, I would point out that what FEMA did during COVID over the last 18, 20 months, I mean, all of these challenges have been, very daunting, but FEMA streamlined their grant process. And if we can somehow learn some lessons from that that didn't result in people using money for things they shouldn't be using money for, we would say, hey, if it worked here, maybe we can push this into the wildfire arena. And again, just very much appreciate your guys' attention. I know your days are busy.
Thanks, Chief. Appreciate that rundown and comprehensive resources. So Michelle, I'll throw the question to you next. What's working well? What are you seeing federally, et cetera?
Right. So I think we've been doing it sort of two-pronged without Think Wildfire, this policy initiative, looking to where we can provide some support for what's coming through in Congress, but also within 4 states that both have, all 4 have had significant wildfires in the last year or two, and continue to have: California, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado, but also a lot of legislative activity around these issues. So to be able to provide some testimony, to provide some factual information about, what the best practices are, what actually meets these model codes and standards, if, of course, advocating for codes and standards at the state and local level. But if that fall, if they don't feel they can go that far, what are some sensible practices? One state, there was actually a bill floating around about requiring property owners to remove every tree within 300 feet of a structure, which isn't practical and isn't supported by science. It's just an example of where organizations like ours can come in to give the advice that says, here's the state of the art in the science, here's the research, here's the proven technology that is a better idea for you to take a look at when you're trying to solve this problem at the state and local level. I think I'll echo Chief Elliott on FEMA grants. They can be tremendously helpful in the hazard mitigation realm. The new BRIC program, that is the building resilience, is tremendously helpful. And we've had very good talks with some of the folks at FEMA about specifically for wildfire, what would be most useful. And where we're advocating is, again, built environment focus. This is where FEMA does its best work, in my opinion, and I used to work there. Built environment focus for the wildland fire, since the other parts of the federal family tend to be more involved in the landscape, and looking at the best practices that already exist rather than accepting sort of creative applications from folks that maybe aren't aware of those science-backed principles. So we're trying to get them to look at what ICC has, what NFPA has, what the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety has been doing with the structural science around wildfire mitigation. So those are just some of the areas that we've been focusing on.
Thanks, Michelle. And Karl, speaking of codes and standards, I will tip this one over to you.
Cool. Hopefully I'll be able to wrap it up and bring it home. I have heard so much good stuff from my colleagues today, and want to thank them both for the contributions here too. And, kind of having been on the suppression and operations side like Chief Elliott has, and, also kind of a former FEMA person as well, like Michelle has, I can tell you that it's a hard problem that we're looking at here today, and the challenge isn't going away anytime soon. So, maybe I can change the focus here just a little bit towards the home hardening side, resilient building practices, that kind of thing to bring it home. But really the codes and standards are at the heart of increasing community resilience to all hazards, not just wildland fire, but wildland fire is what we're talking about today, and they certainly do help. I'll go back to the discussion of FEMA and talking about how they've incorporated the use of current codes in both their disaster mitigation and their recovery programs. I'll throw out a couple of other names just so that folks can be aware of them. Hazard Mitigation Grant Program is one. Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or BRIC, as Michelle talked about, is certainly one. Thanks to staff and members for getting the Disaster Response Recovery Reform Act, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act passed in 2018, that it really served as the catalyst for BRIC and some foundational change in mitigation. I also would be remiss if I didn't talk about the recovery programs in terms of both the public assistance and individual assistance programs, mostly under public assistance, where we see the greatest focus on incorporating current codes and standards into resilient construction post-recovery. So, all of that said, more can be done, right? So at the federal level, one of the places where we're focused right now is working with our partners at the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and giving them credit for many of the good cooperative agreements that they've got in place. You heard a little bit about NFPA's FireWise program. You heard from Chief Elliott about IAFC's Ready, Set, Go program. Those are two of the hallmarks of, I think, what the Forest Service has contributed to the fire service among its many accomplishments. And we would seek to help continue those as part of an effort like this. I'd also say that we're working with FEMA, the Forest Service, the United States Fire Administration, And we'd like to extend that out further into the federal family to talk a little bit more about prioritizing projects focused on investments in WUI risk identification, risk and hazard mitigation, and also more broadly fire prevention, right? So, I guess I'll wrap with this. As Congress works to advance the infrastructure bill and takes on reconciliation, we've really got maybe 3 points on the codes and standard front that I'd really like to drive home. And there are several ways that Congress and staff can help promote the use of codes and standards. So first and foremost, we feel like dedicated funding to enable FEMA to more effectively support the adoption and effective implementation of hazard-resistant building codes is a must. I had a really great question come from the audience that I answered about, what's your take up on WUI code adoption? And right now, 5 states, 125 plus communities. That's certainly not commensurate with the risk that we've got. So, how do we encourage additional adoption and implementation? Because the enforcement of adoption and adopted regs is really kind of the key here, right? So, we see a lot of lack of resources in communities, and it's really one of the #1 reasons that communities don't update their building codes by adopting more recent additions. And what we really push is being on the 2 most recent editions of whatever codes and standards that you're using. For us, it's the I codes. For NFPA, they've got their codes and standards and so forth. And there are many other standards development organizations like us throughout the country. So, those funds will really help communities adopt hazard-resistant codes, tailor them to their hazards, which I think Chief Elliott hit on pretty well in the built environment, and then fully implement and enforce those codes. There are pre-existing programs, as we talked about, with BRIC and HMGP and others. Frankly, they're not doing enough, and we are hoping that Congress will infuse those programs and pass policy and legislation that gives them even more attention and broadens that attention out across the federal family in appropriate places. The second point is really to ensure infrastructure investments at a minimum adhere to current building codes. So we know with the infrastructure bill and reconciliation out there right now, there's a lot of discussion around infrastructure, and there has been for several years. So the federal government requires current codes for its own portfolio. So if you're the federal government and you're building a building and you're going to build it in a WUI area, you're going to build it according to WUI codes and standards, right? But FEMA is really the only federal entity that requires federally assisted projects to adhere to up-to-date building codes and standards. So, we'd like to see that become increased and apply to any of the projects that come out of any of the infrastructure bills or the reconciliation projects focused on infrastructure, and enhance the focus through BRIC and other programs to be able to help with that. This includes major projects constituting more than $360 billion that are contemplated under the American Jobs Plan. And you know what, of those projects, they won't be built to current codes and standards. They're going to be built to outdated codes and standards in many parts of the country unless we act. And then finally, just a quick note on tax incentives, which are fairly easy to get done. Like the Disaster Savings and Resilient Construction Act of 2021, or rebates like the Home Wildfire Risk Reduction Rebate Program of last Congress's Clean Economy, Jobs, and Innovation Act. Focusing on those 3 efforts would incentivize that hazard-resistant construction, and it would also increase community resilience to all hazards, including wildland fire. So thanks for the time to get all that out here today, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Karl. And I will say we are happy to take questions. As you've just heard for the last 45 minutes or so, we have a great panel with significant expertise. So there's no question too small. So while folks might be thinking, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function. Just want to reiterate that we really appreciate your time today and your being here and your partnership. And I think I can speak for all the organizations on this call when we say that we would love to be a resource for you, and that we completely understand that this is not that this goes both ways. So if you have questions or you're interested in working more in this space, and obviously there's a significant amount to do and a significant need, please feel free to reach out to any of the panelists or also to CFSI, and all of the organizations represented on this panel are on CFSI's National Advisory Committee, along with about 35 other organizations. So we are always happy to try to work with you if you've got questions or trying to understand a little bit more about the space. So while people are potentially thinking of questions to ask, Karl and Michele, I've actually got a question that Chief Elliott, feel free to jump in if you want, but I think might be good to have them take a stab. So when we talk about codes and standards and using up-to-date codes and standards, on its face, that makes a lot of sense. You want to make sure that we're taking into account new science, new understanding, maybe new building materials, et cetera, and understanding sort of how those might be affected by day-to-day wear and tear, natural disasters, et cetera. But when we talk about, as we're looking at infrastructure, for example, and as we're talking about using up-to-date codes and standards, particularly for wildland fire, like, what does that mean? So I understand that there's a lot of things that go into these codes that work together, but I know home hardening was thrown out, defensible space. Can you give a little bit of an example of when we say up-to-date codes and standards, what kinds of things are we talking about in terms of looking at property or looking at urban planning, et cetera?
Sure. I'd like to just address it sort of in general, Carl, if you don't mind. I think in general, these codes, what we're looking at, and Carl mentioned the land use as well, it's just as important. So basically home ignition potential and reducing that ignition potential to homes isn't just the structure itself. So when we say building code, it's a real shorthand. And a lot of people think, well, if you just build it this way, it's fine. It is in wildfire, actually for hurricane and things like that, yes, it's just the building. And that's really important to pay attention to good sound construction for natural hazards that may impact you. But in wildfire, it's going to be the home itself and everything around it within, depending on slope and depending on local conditions, 100 to 200 feet. So when you're planning out that subdivision, if there are no land controls that kind of address, we don't want these structures super close together where people are now going to build a fence and put privacy screening and flammable plants in so that they can shade because they're too close to their neighbor. If we don't think about gates and where they lock and where they open, these seem like really simple no-brainer things, but I'm sure Chief Elliott can tell you that gates that open the wrong way are not good for fire suppression when you're trying to save a home. Water supply for firefighting is part of that infrastructure. When you're saying, like, we're building out off the grid out here in the rural area, folks aren't necessarily thinking, oh yeah, we need to provide these alternative water supplies for firefighting. So it's a whole package beyond the building itself. The building itself, what we're talking about is fire-resistant materials on particularly the roof, but siding, windows, and other elements, and then using landscaping techniques that make it easier, for new development. It will make it easier for the property owner to maintain that in a good condition over time, because it is, again, some of that homeowner responsibility to take care of the property to keep it in an ignition resistant condition. But it is definitely more than just build a nice solid structure and you're done. It does evolve into the landscape itself for protection of the home, but then all of the techniques and issues with firefighting, as well as what are your neighbors doing and how close are your neighbors to your property. That really calls for that community-wide landscape approach.
Yeah, good points, Michelle. And the other place that I would point to as well is that this has really got to be a cooperative effort from the beginning, right? So I would point to places in community planning, the American Planning Association, as a place where folks might want to think about focusing some effort too, because so much of what happens with community planning and particularly zoning decisions up front drive what codes and standards and building codes and in effect the mitigation techniques that you just talked about, all of them really good. Those are driven by those planning decisions that are made early on. So if we don't see the planners and the zoning folks having those discussions with their code officials early on, and code officials includes folks like Chief Elliott and the folks in his prevention division and other fire prevention professionals throughout the country, you could be at a point where you've got building codes and standards that are being driven by choices that maybe you didn't quite mean to make. So the more we can do to address that up front is super important. The other piece that I'd say is on codes and standards. We update them every 3 years. I know NFPA is on a regular cycle for the model codes. And with the technology and the innovations and the data that we have today versus even 10 years ago or more, The technology is moving incredibly quickly, and that's why I think you hear that cry from standards development organizations like NFPA and the Code Council talking about stay on the two most recent editions of the codes and standards, so that you've got the very best protection and science and data available to you. So, I'll leave you with this. Only about a third of U.S. communities facing, damaging winds, hurricane, tornado, seismic, flood, or even wildland fire have adopted hazard-resistant building codes and standards, right? Only 16 out of thousands of counties in the cities in the U.S. have achieved the top score by ISO and Veris through their 2019 National Building Code Assessment Report. So, that shows you that there is a gap to be closed here and lots more coordinated discussion to be had in terms of using what's right for you.
Great, thanks, Karl. And since we're getting close to the hour, we'll do a last call. If you've got a question, feel free to type it in or throw your hand up, whatever is easier for you. But in the interim, thanks to everyone who attended today, and also thanks to our panel, Karl and Michele. It's great to have you, and thanks for sharing your expertise. Chief Elliott, thanks for everything you and your department are doing. I think it is great to get a look at what it takes on the ground and what kinds of challenges you all are facing, aside from the obvious, and this understanding that there really are, it's so important that we have interoperability and that we work together at the federal, state, and local levels, particularly since this is a problem that affects everyone. So with that, thank you all for your time today. Thanks to attendees for their time today. If you have any questions or are interested in interacting with the panelists or working further on this issue, please feel free to reach out, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks all.
Thank you.